Ukraine, and here at home, increasing hostility toward the trans community, especially trans youth. The world needs compassion right now, more than at any other time in human history. One of my favorite Christian authors, and you probably know who it is because I refer to him a lot, is the late Marcus Borg. I've read and I've led study groups on every one of his books. The God We Never Knew, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, and The Heart of Christianity, to name just a few. And a common theme in all of Borg's books and lectures is that being a Christian is not primarily a matter of believing certain doctrines, dogmas, and creeds, but is rather about a relationship with God and with one another. It's about how we live our lives in this world. It's not about pie in the sky by and by, but about transformation in this life, here and now. And in fact, Marcus Borg sums it up when he says this. He says, compassion is the central virtue of a life centered in God as known in Jesus. Compassion is the central virtue of a life centered in God as known in Jesus. It's hard to define exactly what compassion means, but we all recognize it when we see it or when we feel it. And many people have tried to define it. Noah Webster of dictionary fame begins his definition of compassion in this way. He says, compassion is a suffering with another. And that's from the root words con and passion, with passion, a painful sympathy, he says. A painful sympathy because when we feel compassion, we feel the pain of another person. And in a similar vein, contemporary theologian Frederick Buechner suggests that compassion is the sometimes fatal capacity. That's an interesting turn of phrase, isn't it? The sometimes fatal capacity for feeling what it's like to live inside somebody else's skin. It's the knowledge that there can never really be peace and joy for me until there is peace and joy for you as well. And historian and author Karen Armstrong says something very practical. She says, compassion is like driving a car. You don't learn to drive a car by reading the owner's manual. You have to get behind the wheel and get into the traffic. Now, these definitions of compassion are all different, and yet they all have something in common. They all suggest that compassion is not only a feeling, but a feeling that provokes such discomfort in ourselves that we feel compelled to act, to change what's going on. It's not just something we feel, it's something we do. Well, in the Bible, there are no shortage of examples of compassion, and especially in the Gospels. For example, the Gospel writers tell us that Jesus had compassion on a large crowd of people who were hungry and had no food. So what did he do? Did he send his thoughts and prayers and heave a sigh of resignation and exit stage left? No, he fed them. And similarly, when Jesus saw two blind men of Jericho, Matthew tells us once again that he was filled with compassion and healed them on the spot. A leper came to Jesus, imploring him, "If you will, you can make me clean." And once again, Jesus felt compassion. And once again, he acted. He stretched out his hand and he touched the untouchable. And in what I call the pièce de résistance, we have today's gospel reading from the Gospel of Luke, a very familiar story to all of us, the story that used to be called the prodigal son, but most biblical scholars are now referring to as the parable of the forgiving father, because the story is really about the father, not the son. But in that story, when that younger son finally saw the error of his ways and returned home, prepared to be treated like a hired hand rather than the son that he was, his father saw him and was filled with compassion and ran out and put his arms around him and kissed him. Now, this verse is very significant because it shows us once again that compassion is more than a feeling. It's not simply an emotion. It's more than feeling sorry for people who are in trouble of some kind. Compassion, the kind of compassion that the Bible talks about, means that you see a problem, you're moved by the need, and then you go out to where the problem is and you get your hands dirty trying to help one person after another. But as always, the real question, the $1,000,000 question is, how might we practice compassion? Could practicing compassion really be as easy as 1, 2, and 3? Well, John Philip Newell, who's the author of the book, The Rebirthing of God, believes that it can. And by the way, I'll just say this as in parentheses, John Philip Newell is a former warden or director of the Iona community in Scotland, where I spent 3 months as a volunteer housekeeper of all things 7 years ago. And I'm just mentioning that because I'm going to mention Iona later on. John Philip Newell, in this book of his, The Rebirthing of God, proposes that compassion calls us to move from the courage to see, to the courage to feel, to the courage to act. The courage to see. All of us, I suspect, tend to like to hang around with people who are a lot like us. People who look like us, people who have the same values as we do, and maybe even vote the same way we do. We tend to live our lives in silos because it's just more comfortable that way. Some of us live in gated communities, either literally or more likely metaphorically. Although I live in a condo with a concierge at the front who judges whether people get to come in or not. The more time we spend around people who look like us and sound like us and believe like us, the harder it becomes to really see the other when we journey out into the real world. We have to be very intentional, and by we, I mean me, about exposing ourselves to people and to situations that are very different from our own. You know, by pushing our comfort level just a little bit. Those of us who live in bubbles, which is to say all of us, need to intentionally burst those bubbles from time to time, seeing the rich diversity and difference right here in our own community. And then, maybe, hopefully, we find the courage to actually see, to see what's really going on around us. And once we can see, then we can move on to Newell's second action, which is the courage to feel. Now, this is a bit trickier, of course, because you can't really make yourself feel something that you don't actually feel. But when we intentionally burst that bubble I was talking about, when we intentionally step outside our own comfort zone and meet people who are different from us, when we get to know these people, by actually talking to them and hearing their stories and sharing our experiences, when we do that, we begin to recognize the challenges that we all have in common. Even simple everyday things like struggling to make a living, raising our children, working at our relationships, our attempts to make the world a better place. I mentioned Iona a minute ago, and now I want to talk about a fellow volunteer with me at Iona who became a very good friend. We were together for 3 months, living in a small house with 14 volunteers living in it and 2 bathrooms. So you get to know each other pretty well. Lori is American, but she's lived all her adult life in Brazil. And in her own words, she described her life in a theologically conservative evangelical church and family in Brazil. She described that as living in a bubble. She lived her whole life in that bubble with the same people, doing the same things, going to the same church. And she intentionally broke that bubble. She intentionally placed herself outside her comfort zone by coming to Iona, where diversity and difference and inclusiveness are the watchwords. People came to Iona from all over the world, both volunteers like me and guests, and they are diverse theologically as well as geographically. From conservative evangelical Christians like Lori to progressive liberal Christians like me or whatever I am, to agnostics and atheists. They're all there. I really have to give Lori credit for doing what most of us spend our whole lives avoiding, intentionally putting herself in a context, in a situation where she knew that she would probably experience some level of discomfort. Whatever our differences, and they may be many, our everyday challenges we discover are very much the same. They're things we all share. And once we realize that we have these common struggles, these shared joys, and these shared commitments, then we can find the courage to feel. And this leads hopefully to the third action that Newell talks about, the courage to act. Living life with our eyes wide open and in touch with our feelings inside, we are inevitably led down a path toward compassionate action. Because once we actually see the world around us, we can never not see that again. And once we actually feel the pain of another person, we can never not feel that pain again. But this is not to say that this step will be easy. I'll talk about my own experience and say that there have been lots of times as a pastor, also just as a Christian in my own life, when I have seen another person's situation very clearly. I see it. And I've even felt their pain. And I know darn well what I should do and what I need to do, but I just don't want to do it. I don't have the strength. I'm too tired, I'm discouraged, I'm preoccupied. I don't have the courage to take that next step and act. Well, sometimes, and I'm going to borrow a well-known slogan here from Nike, sometimes we have to just do it. Whether we feel like it or not, that's not the question. We have to just do it. We have to make that difficult phone call that we would rather not make. We have to sit beside that hospital bed when it's the last place we want to be. We have to march in that protest. We have to write that letter or attend that rally, whether we feel like it or not. Courageous compassion, the courage to see, the courage to feel, and the courage to act. I know that it may sound simplistic to some, but just think about it. If every word that we said, if every thought that we had, if every action that we did was first passed through the filter of compassion, well, the world still might not be perfect, but it would be a heck of a lot better than it is now. And unfortunately, in a way, as Christians, we can't say that we don't know what's expected of us. We can't plead ignorance because Jesus in the Gospels has very clearly shown us the way of compassion. And so we need to do what he did. We need to see, we need to feel, and then we need to act. We are called to live a life marked by courageous compassion. And may God give us the strength and the courage to do that. Thanks be to God.